drug, and let's say there are certain lawsuits that are brought up, the FDA might even take certain drugs back off the market. Yeah, so I would say, to answer your wife's question, usually at least a decade to come up with a completely new medication. Yeah.
Okay, and from my understanding, I think, not to dive into that subject, but with vaccines, it's usually 10 to 15 years to develop vaccines and test them as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially new technologies of vaccines. And it's unheard of that something comes onto the market and within a few months it's recommended to pregnant women. That is unheard of. Yes.
Very interesting. Okay. So her next question is, since we know that there are a lot of common practices today are based on very inadequate studies and theories, so to speak, do you know what types of studies were done prior to the release and approval of the first forms of contraception?
Yeah, my goodness. This is something I only learned about a few years ago. Very controversial history of the birth control pill. And I even, just in preparation for this, I wrote down a few timelines just because I didn't want to forget any names. But just to give you a quick background, in the United States, the first birth control pill was approved in 1960. Prior to that, birth control was actually illegal until there was a Supreme Court ruling in 1965 that allowed birth control for married couples. Because in 1873, Congress had passed, the Comstock Act, and it made contraception illegal. It made it even illegal to advertise or talk about birth control. And then there were certain historical figures that have a very shady past, but who played very big roles in making this whole birth control being approved here in the United States happen. And one of those figures was Margaret Sanger. Have you heard of her?
Oh, absolutely. I've done extensive research on her, and it's interesting. She's held up on a huge platform, or people kind of look to her as a hero. But when you look into her path and the not to go into, but she was very deeply racist. Horrible, horrible comments she made. But yeah, she had an interesting path, to say the least.
Yeah, she was the founder of the American Birth Control League in 1921, which later became Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood tried to distance themselves from her ideology. But when you do a Wikipedia search, you will not find anything about her racist ideology in the Wikipedia page. That's how biased media is, or certain newspaper articles. But there is enough information where you can find on her that she was really seen as a hero for women's rights, birth control rights, and reproductive rights, and a feminist idol. But really, her ideology was founded, from very, very discriminatory ideas on that there was a certain part of the population that needed to be eliminated. In her eyes, those were the poor, the mentally and physically incapable, so handicapped, and minorities such as, indigenous people and Black people. And she put a lot of effort into obviously propagating birth control in Black communities. She helped found certain birth control clinics in other countries. And she was one of the people who encouraged she encouraged one of the researchers of the birth control to actually pursue this research, and his name was Gregory Pincus. And so she approached him. He did research on birth control, and together with Clarence Gamble, who was the heir to what is the company? Gamble and Procter and Gamble. Yeah, he was a heir. He was a physician too, and he had birth control clinics in Puerto Rico, India, Japan, and he was a eugenist. Margaret Sanger was a eugenist, and together with Gregory Pincus, they conducted studies on birth control, and they did the first big study on birth control in Puerto Rico, and they had about 130 women in their trial. they were not allowed to do those studies in the United States because, as I said earlier, in the 1950s, birth control was still illegal here. So they had to do their studies. So they went to Puerto Rico, didn't really consent women properly, told them this was to avoid contraception, but didn't tell them about all the potential side effects. And at that time, the doses of the birth control were much higher than what we are using now. So there was a lot more side effects to it. And so there was a lot of questionable ethics involved in the development of the birth control and in the studies. And I believe that the Clarence Gamble that I told you about, he himself had forced sterilization to women on women in his birth control clinics. And a lot of it was also done, in African American population. And it's just, there was so much questionable stuff down back then. And so I find it interesting that, Planned Parenthood is hailed as something so important for women's rights, and the history of it is so questionable, and even the birth control, the way the studies were conducted. So hopefully things are much more ethical nowadays. I believe even before Puerto Rico, they did some trials on mentally and physically handicapped people in mental institutions in United States, in Massachusetts. So it's just crazy what they did. But in the end, they were able to get it approved by the FDA. And then the Supreme Court ruling in 1965 made it legal to use birth control. And then in the 90s and the 2000s, so many new birth control, like the technology that evolved, and so many different forms of birth control were developed since then. And I think just recently, 2023, the FDA approved another birth control, which is the first over-the-counter pill, and it's called Opill, and it's synthetic progestin only, doesn't contain the synthetic estrogen.
Interesting. Well, I want to touch on something you just said, because a lot of people don't know this. And, I've had the intention not to condemn people on the left, because I truly think, like you said, a lot of people don't know about, for example, with Margaret Sanger, with her past as being a eugenist. And what I found interesting is I love history, right? Because history tells us what to look out for. And so, many people in America, rightfully so, condemn Nazis and Nazi Germany, what happened, but Hitler was into eugenics, just like Margaret Sanger. And so it's interesting that she's been made as an icon or hero on the left, but I know from speaking to people personally on the left that many of them don't know this history. So I'm actually surprised that you knew this history, that you brought this up. I think it's amazing. I think it's important for people to know.
But what is really shocking is that none of that was ever discussed in medical school. And we didn't talk about the influence of John D. Rockefeller on medical school and our teachings. We didn't discuss that Rockefeller was a big funder of Margaret Sanger's clinics, So there's always all these connections. And I believe even Bill Gates' father was friends with her, right? That's where Bill Gates gets his philanthropic eugenic ideas from, So I think there's so many connections that I had to make on my own, and none of that was taught in medical school. In fact, 99% of OBGYNs are not aware of what I just told you.
Well,